I see lots of friendly faces in chat. It's good to see you, friends. EJ, what are we talking about today?
So, I think the plan was to talk about language learning apps, which is awesome because I think we both have a lot of thoughts and opinions on the subject.
Yes, there are many feels to be had when it comes to language learning apps. Oh, man. Okay, well, I don't even know where to start. Should we talk about maybe the most infamous one?
Well, maybe let's start a little bit more abstractly, actually, about like what would make an app effective from a theoretical standpoint.
Gotcha.
Like, what would your ideal language learning app look like? And then maybe we can dive in to specific ones.
Yeah. So let's maybe take an even further step back and just talk about the language learning process and how people acquire language. And I'm not just saying, like, we're going to shift our vocabulary here for just a second because we need to say you acquire a language, you don't just learn a language. So I think we've talked about this distinction before, but to just clarify, to acquire a language means to like fully embrace it, learn it, understand it, and like you're not just like, you don't just have a list of vocabulary words, you understand like idiomatic phrases and the right tone of voice for certain situations, things like that. So it's a little bit more layered and nuanced than just having a go-to list of vocabulary words. And so the things that go into acquiring a language, there's been a lot of research done on this, you can imagine. And the best way to learn a language is a combination of like immersion, being around people, being around the language, being immersed in it, and actual like instruction. So like textbook learning like how do you structure a sentence? How do you conjugate verbs? The ideal situation requires both of those. So if you have a little bit of both, it helps you acquire a language faster and
I would say though that the like immersion interaction aspect is definitely more important than the textbook aspect because like you can learn a language the way that a child learns a language by using it, by being exposed to it. The actual textbook aspect of like, I could speak English perfectly without being able to define what a verb and what a noun is and what types of conjugations I'm using. Like, you don't actually need to understand that to be able to use and be proficient in a language.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. The textbook learning is definitely a smaller part, and in some instances, it's a fairly negligible part. People acquire languages as adults all the time through just immersion. So it is just one of those, in the academic world, they found that like, if you have a blend of the two, then you'll acquire it possibly like faster or more efficiently. But you can still acquire it with just textbook learning and just immersion. It's just, it might take you a little bit longer or you might have certain struggles. So
and if you're only using a textbook and you're never actually practicing it, you're never actually generating language, then you're going to have issues. I actually wrote my master's thesis on language learning apps, and the aspects of language pedagogy or language teaching that I focused on for my thesis were interaction, actually communicating and using the language, whether that's in a spoken or a written form, feedback, which is something that comes naturally when you're communicating with people. Like, they're either going to understand what you're going to say and react the way you want, or they're not. And there's lots of different types of feedback that are useful in different ways. Mm-hmm. And then also input and it being authentic. So what authentic input would be is like sentences that an actual native speaker would use, and not just in isolation, but in context.
Yes. That's a big thing, is not just learning things in isolation, because it's very, like, you can learn things in isolation and try to commit them to memory, but language isn't about memory. There are certain aspects that are, of course, memory adjacent. Like we do use our memory when we're using language, but language is an active creative process, taking context and building on top of that, right? And so rote memorization doesn't get you very far when it comes to acquiring language because it's an active process.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. If I can touch on something else. So my master's thesis, it was pedagogy and usability in language learning apps. And so I think, those things that we touched on with actually acquiring a language, being able to use it rather than just speak about it in an academic sense, like those are extremely important.
Yeah.
I think when you're talking about language learning apps, there's also aspects of the usability of an app and how naturally it works, how intuitive it is. Do you need like a manual to be able to use your app, or does it just work? There's other things that I think come into play there as well, and you can also go into like gamification is a fun one.
I mean, let's talk about gamification for a second. So we've touched on a little bit about like what it takes to acquire a language, and we could have a whole other episode about like the acquisition process for language and what is like good ideal language pedagogy, right? But that's not quite what we're talking about today. We're talking about language learning apps. So we have to talk about things like gamification, where like the goal of an app, right, isn't to make you an ideal speaker of that language. When it comes down to it, an app is created by a business to make money. And how do they make money? They get you to download the app, and they get you to keep on the app. They get you to stay on the app. So one of the best ways to do that is through gamification.
Yeah, I will say, I think businesses can be a little bit more nuanced than that. Like, I hope
for sure you would hope so. I'm taking a very cynical view again as a linguist who's an academic and staying within academia. I'm very suspicious of any and all companies. Period.
Right. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if a business is not making money, the business is going to fail. So that's definitely a really big consideration. But a business isn't going to make money if customers aren't finding value in the product.
Yeah.
And so customers need to at least feel like they're progressing in a language in order for them to want to continue paying for the product.
Yes.
Whether people feeling like they're making progress and feeling like it's beneficial actually correlates to them acquiring the language might be a little bit more of an interesting question. But yeah, there definitely are massive incentives, and I think there's trade-offs and decisions that businesses have to make all the time of whether, we're going to make a change to the app that results in more virality and more money coming in versus something that people might not enjoy as much, but that would actually help them acquire the language.
Yep. It's definitely a hard balance, and those who seek to create a language learning app or textbook or audiobook or whatever, those who seek to do that are really, it is a challenge, and it is no easy feat. So to be able to make one that is successful is in and of itself like commendable in some regard. Mm-hmm. Whether that's just like from a business model or like the fact that people do keep using it, that is like commendable.
Definitely.
And I was just gonna say that I don't want to bash language learning apps because I know sometimes I often come across like I'm bashing language learning apps, but they are helpful. They're just limited.
Yeah, so let's dive in a little bit more into maybe gamification, and then maybe we can talk about the ways that language learning apps are successful.
Yeah.
So what are some ways that you've actually seen language be gamified, either in like a classroom or immersion setting or in an app?
Yeah, so I think I don't know if we're going to name drop any specific language learning apps or anything, but in like an app setting, they have very like game-like sounds like ping and like mrr and like all of these very like this is like very playful. These like sounds that are associated for when you get something wrong and when you get something right. That is something that is super gamified, and those like specific sounds alone, like because of our associations with those sounds, they automatically put you in a gaming headspace. So even just like the sounds associated with those language learning apps.
And from a language, learning acquisition standpoint, that also acts as instant feedback for the user. Like apps can use sounds, like Stacy said. They also use visuals, like things will be highlighted in red or green based on whether it was right or wrong. And then there might also be actual text saying this is right, this is wrong. Like there's a lot of ways that feedback is given, but yeah, it can definitely contribute to the gamification as well.
Yeah. Another thing is other like game-like scenarios, and this is something that I've used in the classroom that is also used in apps, and that's things like matching, right? Like matching a picture to a word, or matching the translation of a word to the other word in the language, in the target language. I remember this one time in my class, we were learning about animals, and this was my more advanced class, and so I pulled out all the stops when it came to animals. I was like, all right, let's see how many animals they really know. And so we had things like ostrich and dolphin, things that aren't just like dog, cat, horse, cow.
That's fantastic.
And we had two different teams, and we pitted them against each other, and they had to like match them up before the other team did. Right? And it was very funny. Some of them were like, I don't even know what this is in my own language. So it was a more advanced thing. But that's another way that I kind of gamified the process of learning animals. Like that's just a quick vocabulary thing that I did. And that's something that you see in language learning apps a lot as well, especially with just like something like rote memorization, like things like vocabulary, like learning your animals. That's just like something you kind of have to commit to memory. It's not something you can kind of puzzle together.
Yeah, definitely. That makes me actually think of language classes that I had growing up. When I lived in Iceland in middle school, I actually took the international school there was inside of an Icelandic school. And so I actually had some classes with the Icelanders. Mm-hmm. And one of those was a Danish class. Oh. So I had a Danish class that was taught in Icelandic. And I remember us doing games where we would like split into teams. And it was like translation based because the teacher would say like a number in Icelandic, and then the goal was to see which team could say it the fastest in Danish.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because there's also drawbacks to using translation actually in language learning and acquisition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. Sometimes direct translation isn't necessarily useful or relevant to certain contexts. And a lot of times you need to understand the broader context in order to convey the right idea in the right way. Jeff here in chat mentioned that there are a lot of different ways to say things in Japanese, and oftentimes if you're using a language learning app, you can be too polite or too casual. Yes. And especially in situations like Japanese where there is a lot of like politeness like embedded into the language, like having certain types of hierarchies and stuff like as a part of everyday use of language, you need that context in order to successfully learn the language.
Definitely. And that's a case where translation as like a mode of learning actually fails a lot because there aren't always direct translations. Yes. And usually when people are using translation for learning, they're looking for those direct translations because everything can be translated, but a good translation isn't going to just have the same words and phrase things the exact same way in the target language as in the source language. It's going to modify things to focus on getting the meaning across first and foremost.
Right.
So especially like in that example with formality, English is rather lacking in the formality department compared to other languages. Like we used to have a distinction between you and thou And I
which
believe
for
you
people is like the proper form of you. It's very old.
Right, yeah, it's a very old form, but there used to actually be a formality distinction between those two, where I believe you was the more formal one and now was the informal one. But we've lost that in English over time, and now we do have formality in the sense that, especially in like the southern US, or in certain communities, there'll be people who will use words like sir or ma'am to be formal, but that's also like a little bit locale dependent.
Yeah, and it isn't. Yeah,
and
and like you said, it isn't wrapped up into the grammar like other languages have. So there's something that in linguistics we call TV features, and there's a reason we call them TV features. But I think about it as the tu and vous features from like French. Those
right,
are, like,
I think about it as tu and usted from Spanish. We also have someone pointing out du and sie in our chat in German.
Similar stuff. So that is like encoded in the grammar. You have to be able to conjugate things correctly given a certain circumstances, a certain amount of formality, those kinds of things. So other languages definitely have those baked in, and oftentimes without like certain context, without knowing how old your speaker is or, you know, who they are in relation to you, you kind of just have to guess and just kind of throw something out there. And, you know, I'm sure many a language learner has had an awkward time or an awkward encounter where they used like improper formality or something like that, and we're like what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe lightly scolded for their choices.
Right. And so that's like one thing with translation is sometimes translations aren't going to be perfect. But the other problem with using translation in like a language acquisition sense is that fundamentally, if you're acquiring a language, you want to form a direct connection between the object and the word. So like if I have a tree, I want to be thinking of the word tree in the target language. I don't want to be thinking the word tree, and then if I'm going from like, say I'm going from English to Spanish, I don't want to be seeing a tree, thinking tree, and then going from tree to árbol. Yes. Like I want to be going directly between the target language and have that meaning attached to the object, to the thing. You don't want to constantly be translating in your head. Like ideally you're acquiring the language in such a way that it's just natural and you don't need to go through those extra steps.
Exactly. Yes.
There was one point I wanted to make actually with that. Like the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages actually has a recommendation as far as using your source language versus your target language. Oh my gosh, my dog is squeaking, but that's fine. But yeah, they recommend that you use 90% or more, like at least 90% of the time that you use the target language in language instruction.
Yeah, no, it's that using 90% of your language, of your target language, is part of that immersion factor, right? And so it's a big part of whenever you're learning to have that element of immersion by using it as much as possible, making those mistakes, and finding out what the consequences of those mistakes are. That's how your brain will like start to put the patterns together in a more efficient way than just rote memorization.
Cool. Should we dive into what apps do well? Yeah,
let's start name dropping.
All right. Can I actually? So for my master's thesis, one of the things that I found was that 3 different language learning apps had researchers perform a study comparing the app's effectiveness to the effectiveness of a college course. And there was actually some really interesting stuff from that. Let me see if I can find the actual numbers so I'm not like misspeaking here.
Yeah, no worries.
So there's these researchers, Veselinov and Grego, did this study comparing, like I said, the apps to a college course. And so they did a college placement test at the beginning of their time frame and at the end of the time frame. And what they found when they did this for Duolingo, Rosetta Stone, and Busuu is that they found that 55 hours using Rosetta Stone was equivalent to a college course in 2008, which is when that first study was done. 34 hours of Duolingo was equivalent to a college course in 2012, and 22 and a half hours of Busuu was equivalent to a college course in 2016. So they did these studies and came up with those interesting results. Those are like the average times that they found in their comparisons. Mm-hmm. And you'll actually see like these different studies are advertised, of course, by these language learning programs to say, hey, we're as good or even better than a college course, which is pretty cool. But there's actually some oddities about this research as well. Like obviously the apps just draw out that single number of like the average hours, and really try to highlight the efficiency with that. But when you read the actual studies, like for the Duolingo one, I have the actual study here. It says, the study estimated that a person with no knowledge of Spanish would need between 26 and 49 hours to cover the material for the first college semester of Spanish. So it's like a pretty broad range. Yeah. But the most interesting thing from the study actually, for the Duolingo one, is that, you know, they split it up by different demographics to see if there were trends or different things like that. And 11 out of 44 women in the Duolingo study actually decreased their results using Duolingo over time, which is like, were those people actually using the app? What effort were they putting into it? Like, there's a lot of questions with that, but like, it's not a massive pool of people that they're studying. Obviously, if there's like 44 women total, I think there were about 88 people total in the study. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you actually had some people who decreased their results. And it's, in my opinion, comparing the usefulness of an app to a college course is interesting because there's such a wide range of effectiveness of a college course depending on who your teacher is and what the curriculum looks like.
Yeah. And something that also probably doesn't get discussed when talking about these language learning apps and the studies around them is the average time that a person uses the app. Because you can say total number of hours, right? You can say like 24 hours in this app is going to you know, make you, is about the same as like a college course. But when you think about it, the average person, if you're using it daily, is probably only on there for like 10 to 15 minutes at a time, right? And that's part of the advertising of some of these apps is like, oh, only a few minutes a day and you'll be like up to speed. But when you consider that, you're like, okay, well, a college course takes a semester. That's about 3 or 4 months, depending on, you know, it's about 3 or 4 months. But then if you have 5 minutes a day on an app, it's going to take you almost like a year or more to get to that 24 hours that the college course kind of accelerates by giving you like 2 or 3 hours a week. So that's something else to like consider, is that if you're using it only in small chunks of time, it's going to take you longer to get to that period where they're saying that it's equivalent to a college course.
Yeah, there's definitely some interesting things about that as well. Like, does the way that people chunk their learning on an app differently from in a class impact their learning? Like, what are the other factors that are actually going into play there? Mm-hmm. But like, these studies are super, super interesting, and fundamentally, like, they do show that language learning apps can be effective.
Yeah, and I mean, having spoken with many people, polyglots, people learning English, like, you know, I've talked to a bunch of people about language learning apps. They're not useful. They're not, you know, they are worthwhile to an extent, right? But definitely. You definitely get to that point in your language learning where you're going to you need more context. You need more human interaction to fully understand the language. And an app doesn't give you a lot of that like context or, you know, that one-on-one, you know, immediate like response that a person does. It just doesn't.
I think that you're basing that off of your experience with language learning apps, which is totally valid.
Yes.
I don't think that that needs to be a restriction of language learning apps, though. Like, there are apps that enable instant communication between people. There's
one called italki. I'm familiar with that one. And that one is less of like a language learning app and more of like a, hey, you speak this language and I speak this language, let's talk.
Yeah, there is that. But there's other ones as well that will give you some of that interaction. Mm-hmm. Like Duolingo doesn't really give you that interaction between people. So like some of the popular ones don't really do that. I think the one that I looked at that was actually pretty good as far as interaction was Busuu. Mm-hmm. Actually had interaction with other speakers.
Interesting.
And one of the apps that I looked at, you could like record yourself speaking and then someone else would give you feedback on it relatively quickly. So it wasn't like instantaneous, but within a few minutes, I actually got feedback from multiple people, which was really cool. So like there's no reason that apps can't do that. But like you said, a lot of apps don't do that. So like when I was doing this comparison a few years ago, like Memrise and Babbel had no way to interact with other learners or with teachers or native speakers. Like interaction just wasn't part of it. Duolingo, I think, did have a option to do a little bit of written interaction with other students. But like if you're using Duolingo, it's a lot of these sentences taken fully out of context and like not actually a lot of interaction. But just because they don't do it doesn't mean that apps couldn't. Like I think there's actually a huge potential for language learning apps to make huge improvements in that area.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree. And like with technology becoming more advanced and stuff, I think it's easier to incorporate some of those more human-like elements into an app, getting that feedback, interacting with other people, getting more like direct practice. But yeah, with like Duolingo, I mean, they don't even have sentences that you would probably never say. Stuff like, the horse eats bacon on Tuesdays, right?
Oh my gosh. That's so true. Well, and they actually advertise that as like, you know, it's easier to memorize words and stuff if, you know, it's an interesting and fun sentence, which like there is a little bit of merit to that. Like if I tell you a random sentence and it's just weird and super memorable, like, yeah, you might remember that sentence. But if you have more language fully in context, like a story or a whole conversation, in the long run, that's going to be so much more effective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So maybe we should hit this a little harder on the head, be a little more direct. Based on some of your research, EJ, which apps do you think are the most worthwhile for our listeners? If there are any, like, you could be perfectly honest.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one thing that we haven't actually touched on at all, one of the other benefits to a language learning app is that an app can provide access to a language that you might not have access to at your local school or university. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's kind of silly examples with that, like Duolingo offering, you know, Klingon or High Valyrian, which are like created languages that aren't going to be super useful. But Duolingo does also offer Navajo, for instance, and a bunch of other languages that might not be accessible. And so I'd say if you're looking for a language learning app, there's a lot of factors that you're going to need to consider, because none of these apps offer every single language. And so which language you want to learn is going to be a big defining factor. But if you're trying to learn like a more widely spoken language, then you're probably going to have more options. Mm-hmm. And what I found when I was doing this research, when I was doing this, I think Pokemon Go had come out not too long before and was still super, super popular. And, I selected the apps with the most downloads in the Play Store to compare them. And I was expecting there to be more variety. I was expecting apps to do things like Pokemon Go does, with like maybe where you are in the world could have some impact on what the app shows you. Maybe you could like choose conversations. Maybe you could do these different things. But when I was comparing them, they were all very, very similar. It's almost like they're copying each other in providing these like single sentences, this instant feedback with that sound, with that color. So in that sense, like at least the ones that I looked at weren't actually super distinct from each other in a lot of ways, other than like, Busuu actually had more interaction, which was really cool. And I only compared 4 apps. Like there's a limit to how much
of course.
To. I've used like Rosetta Stone's website in the past, and they actually are better as far as just using the target language, for instance, than these apps that I looked at. But as far as choosing one, like I think Busuu is really cool based on the interactive content. I think any app that forces you to actually generate conversation and communicate with other people is going to ultimately be more effective. Yeah. If you can have that authentic content. One thing that Duolingo does, not technically part of their app, but I believe they have podcasts where you actually can get more of that language in context. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's really, really useful. Another thing we haven't talked about is just like personal preference and personal learning style. Like you might find that you really love Duolingo and that just really personally jives with you. Mm-hmm. And that's awesome. Like no matter what, if you can find something that you're going to do, that you're going to use, that's probably going to be better than not doing anything at all as far as your language learning. So I think that's a huge thing. Like I've personally done Duolingo's Esperanto course because that sounded like a fun thing for me. Yeah. And so I learned some about Esperanto. I definitely can't speak Esperanto, but it was cool. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, and to kind of tack on to that, I talked about like immersion and like a classroom setting, and that's kind of like the ideal blend is having some of that like, actual grammar work where it's like explicit grammar work and, that immersion interaction. But the thing that I didn't mention, the thing that's probably the most important is motivation. Like ultimately, if you're motivated to learn a language, then you will learn it. Your brain will find a way. But getting motivated is half the battle. And anyone who's learned any skill, whether it's playing piano, playing a sport, picking up any sort of hobby, that motivation makes or breaks your progress. And if there is a language app that you really connect with, that you think motivates you, if you love that little ping when you get your sentence right in Duolingo, and that just like makes your day, like go for it. Yes, by all means. But if that is something that doesn't work for you, like I have a hard time with language learning apps. I need to be talking to a person. I need to be in that constant interaction with them. That's what motivates me, is having those like tangible consequences and seeing my language play out in person. That's what motivates me, and it might motivate you. So ultimately, you want an ideal pedagogical blend, but as long as you're motivated, that language learning is going to happen.
Definitely. And like, I'm hoping that more and more apps will implement, features that allow you to have that interaction, that communication, that authentic input, all of those things. Like there's aspects of those already in, lots of these apps. So it's just a question of, where are they going to go in the future? Like these things can change really, really rapidly.
Oh yeah. These apps are getting updated almost daily. That's like where we're at technology wise. So things are always changing.
Definitely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really cool that a lot of these apps have gained traction. Like I mentioned those studies, like there's definitely flaws in those studies. There's definitely, well, maybe not. Like I think the researchers actually did a good job with the studies themselves. I think there's some flaws from the data that the apps themselves extrapolate from those studies.
Of course. That's you're going to find that in any study.
Right. But they do show like these apps are effective. So like Stacey said, you find what works for you, what you're motivated to use, and then whatever you feel like is missing in whatever app you're using, try and find a way to fill in that gap. So if you're not getting interaction using Duolingo, maybe you can join some, Facebook group practicing that target language. Maybe you can, watch movies in that target language to get more of that authentic input. Like there's a lot of things you can do. And I think if you constrict yourself to only one method of learning, to only getting input from one location, even that if that's like a college course, you're not going to gain as much as if you try to recreate more of that immersive environment for yourself.
It's absolutely true. The more input you can get, the better. The more interaction you can get, the better. However you choose to get it, just get it. just embrace it.
Yeah. So I think Duolingo, they don't have the interaction, but I think they've done an awful lot to raise awareness of different languages and to give people opportunity. And, there's a lot of competitors that people can look at. Babbel, Busuu, Italki, I think you mentioned. There's actually a lot. So
there's so much out there.
Yeah, I think it's something worth diving into. I think they can be effective. But like I said, I think you need to also make sure that you are getting that input, getting that interaction, and, finding something that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, EJ. I think we're gonna wrap it up there. This has been great. This is one of the topics that we promised y'all we'd talk about. And I know we don't have a single solitary answer, but when it comes to learning things, there is no single solitary answer. Everybody works a little differently, and we can give our opinions all day long, but ultimately whatever works best for you is just what you gotta do. Feel free to hit us up with any questions or recommendations for future topics on For the Love of Language on Instagram, or if you're here on Twitch, feel free to hit us up in our Discord, and we can talk about and we can continue the conversation there as well.
Yeah, and if you're watching or if you're listening to the podcast and want to watch our live recordings, you can follow Stacey the Linguist on Twitch.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We love and appreciate you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful whatever day it is.
Okay, see y'all later.
Bye.